All right. Can everybody hear all right? All right. Well, it's good to see everybody. We're going to continue in our series this morning that we started last week. It's a series based on the fact that so many in our class and many of those who join us in Zoom and also on YouTube, we're so glad that I've had so much good response to the subject and to the discussion going on. The whole series is really based on the fact that so many of our class members and those who participate in these other means have experienced in the last few years, experienced great losses, some of them different kinds of pain, some kind of different difficulties in their life. And so I thought, what a good time to talk about what the Bible says, especially the works of Jesus and Paul, what they say to us about how to handle the reactions that we have in our minds and in our emotions and in our activities. And so I began to work on this study, began to outline the study, and it turned into God leading me to prepare some thoughts and insights from my own experience and other people and led me to write this book, Prickly Pears. And so instead of just teaching the book, I thought, the 30 different devotions in that book, I thought, no, we won't do that. We'll just take four of the samples of the different devotions and talk about the four key emotions that we have when we go through difficult times, whether it's a death, or whether it's an illness, or whether it's a relationship problem. And by the way, I found out that so many of you who have expressed to me some appreciation for what we're doing, so many of you have realized that these emotions that we have are not only real, but these emotions are something that really determines a lot of what we feel. Psychologists tell us, and have been telling us for the last 50 years, that emotions play about 90% of the influence on what we do and what we think. We don't want to think that, do we? But we have to realize that what we think, what we do, is greatly influenced by how we feel, at least in the short term. And we want to think, as Christians and followers of our Lord, that we can move beyond these emotions or we can turn these emotions for the good. So that's what we're trying to do. And last week we talked about the first most powerful emotion that we have, and that's the negative emotion of anxiety. We're told that the most powerful emotion that you and I have is the emotion to want to feel safe, to want to feel secure above everything else. We don't want to be afraid. We don't want to fear. We want to feel like we're safe in the arms of God and we're safe with our families. And so we're dealing with this issue that in the modern terminology, we use the word anxiety. Anxiety or being anxious is nothing more than fearing. And in fact, it's such an important emotion. I just had a couple of people that I respect that spoke to this. For instance, Robert Leaney, an outstanding author and psychologist, wrote this: "We live in the age of anxiety. Never before have we been more worried of what might go wrong and may never go wrong. Never before have we been more worried. We live in an age of anxiety." One of my favorite preachers of all time was Martin Lloyd-Jones, who said the result of our focusing on ourselves is always an increase in anxiety. And we're going to see that as we move through our lesson. The more we focus on ourselves and not on God, the more our anxiety increases. Anxiety can be a most dangerous thing. Brene Brown, who is a very popular bestseller, and in fact, she's from the University of Houston. She wrote, "Anxiety is one of the most contagious emotions. If you don't own your own anxiety, it will own you and possibly those around you." That's one of the things we're going to be doing in this is we're trying to say, okay, it's all right to admit, to own our own anxieties, and then to do something about it. Uh, the last one I wanted to quote I thought was very important, and that's Joyce Meyer. Some of you heard her. She's a popular speaker and writer, and she wrote, "Anxiety is one of the most dangerous emotions because it makes us live in fear of things that have never happened, stealing our peace and joy." And that's what I want to focus on, not on the problem, but on the solution. So what we're trying to do is we were trying to deal with this issue that Jesus had as a major concern in his teaching. Now, we don't see the word anxiety in the Bible because in those days, the Greek word that we now can translate anxiety, the most authors or most translators translated it worry. For instance, I think a key passage is Jesus said, "I pray that God, the source of hope, will fill you completely with joy and peace because you trust in Him. Then you will overflow with hope." And he said, Jesus told us, he said to not worry. He told us this in very, very clearly and as recorded in the book of Matthew. He said it this way. So don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Now, if you were to translate that word in the modern English, it would read like this. Jesus would said, "Don't be anxious." How do I know that? Because the word merimano means to be unease. It means to be feeling unsafe, to be afraid. It means that you just don't feel like you're in control of things. So Jesus was saying what we use in our modern terms is don't be anxious, don't be stressed out. But in the old translations, of course, it says don't worry. In fact, I want to ask the class for a moment, what does it mean to you when you feel anxious? Can you express it in other words? What are the feelings when you get these bad news or when you're going through something terrible and you say, "I feel anxious. I have anxiety." What does that mean in just everyday terminology? Who would tell me what that means to them?
I'd say it means I'm not in control and I don't like it.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Who else?
When I'm anxious, I usually feel like I have a bunch of energy pent up in my body that I want to do something about.
Yes. Yes, that's good. What else?
I'm afraid of the future.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Anybody else? I hear the word fear, afraid. What are some other words that you think, like in modern days, it's a synonym to worry, to anxious? What's another synonym? Yeah, fellas.
To be fretful. And I think Cheryl hit on something very important. Anxiety doesn't just do things to our thinking, anxiety does things to our body.
Yeah,
So that's a very important thing to think about. And I think it's the absence, Bill, of shalom,
yeah.
peaceful harmony that we have when we're not fretful and anxious.
All right. And by the way, if there's any of you on Zoom that want to contribute, you'll need to hit your uh, mute button so it turns your speaker on. Anybody else have anything they wanted to share?
Yeah, Bill, this is Les. When I start getting anxious, I feel like I'm heading downhill, down a negative direction. And I start thinking about how can I stop this and turn it around? Because, it seems like the further you go down that path, the faster you roll, it gets worse and worse. So to try and figure out a way to turn it around.
That's excellent. That's the way. That's absolutely true for all of us. Well, if it's
Bill, I think of being uptight.
yes, that's a good terminology, Ron. Uptight, uptight, anxious. Well, you can see why so many of these are saying anxiety or being uptight or being stressed out and all, why it's so dangerous. Because it it distorts things. It gets our focus up on important things. It's just very dangerous. That's why Jesus, and I just read one passage over and over again, Jesus points out that we need, if we're going to have peace and a feeling of safety, and some of you are going through some things or have been through some things that you feel very anxious, you feel very uptight and stressed out. Well, this morning we're going to continue to talk about because it's the number one problem. You see, when I say what is the number one problem of mankind, most of you would say, like it does in the scripture, you would say it's pride. Pride causes most of our problems. Well, that's the problem with anxiety. Being anxious is because we're focused on ourselves. We're so focused on ourselves and our problems that we can't think of anything else. So this idea of anxiety and not feeling safe is the number one problem because it's the number one desire. We want to be at peace. We want to feel safe. And if we don't, we struggle with it. And it, by the way, it hurts. And we know even now the medical folks say it. It really, as Phil has brought out, it hurts our body. We get sick. We know that, for instance, I know my oncologist told me, Bill, you got to stay away from stress. You got to stay away from being anxious. Don't get in positions where you're anxious because what it does, it causes inflammation. It causes your cancer to start back up. Isn't that amazing? Jesus told us 2,000 years ago, now don't do this because it's going to hurt you. That's what we're talking about, how to overcome it. Well, we must move on.
Bill,
Yeah. Somebody?
yeah,
Oh,
Bill,
Blanche, yeah, Blanche. Pull your screen,
yes, Blanche.
your pretty face. Pull your,
Thank you.
pull your,
Well, I just want to share an experience of
Blanche,
anxiety.
pull your screen down a little bit so we can see your face. There you
Is
go.
that better? Okay. So, recently I should have called to ask for your prayers and the prayers for the group, but I was so sick that I just didn't want to do anything. Anyway, I was having asthma, and at home I was doing what I had been told to do when I had an asthma episode, but it kept getting worse
Oh,
to the point where the doctor sent me to the hospital for 4 or 5 days, and I developed pneumonia. So
oh,
I was one sick girl. But while I was in the hospital, before that, I had been doing everything that I know to do for asthma. And I know a lot because I've had it for so long. But when I was in the hospital, I was really sick, but I decided to let my caretakers take over and do what they knew they had to do to make me better. And that was a little bit hard to do because, as you know, we feel like we know our bodies, we know what to do, we know more than anybody else. Well, I was just so sick that I thought, well, they know what they're doing. I'm just going to let them do their thing. So after about 4.5 days, I was able to come home.
mhm.
And I've been a lot better. But the doctor said, pneumonia, people don't realize it. Pneumonia zaps the body big time, big time, and especially in a 95-year-old like you. So she said it's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks for you to get all that energy that you lost and the weight that you lost, everything that you lost, is going to take many weeks to get back. So my life is different. I can't drive. My kids won't let me drive. So I have to depend on somebody to drive me here and there and yonder.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. That's very hard for this independent old lady. And, you know, a few other things that have changed, but I I keep thinking in my mind, God knows what he's doing. Uh, he'll take care of my body and of me. So I just try to take it easy. But
Yeah.
it's hard, Bill. It's really hard for an independent person to, as you probably know, to
Yes.
have to slow down and depend on others. It's very, very hard.
Thank you for sharing, Blanche, and we'll pray for you and glad you're trusting in him and trusting in those who he has provided to help you.
Yes.
I know it's a hard job. That's what we're talking about. Thank you for sharing. We're talking about how to stop trying to control things, stop trying to be all about me, but trying to let God, trying to manage whatever comes in our way. Now, last week, we talked about the fact that we're going to use Jesus and Paul as our model, which is exactly what the Bible is all about us doing. And in doing that, I've decided I'd focus on one character other than Jesus, since we spend most of our time talking about Jesus. I thought we'd use one character each time in the Bible that gave us an example of how to follow to turn our problem, which is anxiety today, how to turn our anxieties into peace, how to turn our feelings of not being safe into feeling safe. Well, last week, we started this by saying if we look at Paul, Paul talked about this thorn in the flesh, which nobody knows exactly what it is, but probably something wrong with him physically. And a lot of people, of course, think it was his eyesight. He couldn't see what he's doing. And he said that was always a thorn in his flesh. And there's a lot of evidence for that. But he said they had a lot of other things, physical things, persecution, imprisonment, all that stuff. And we said, how did Paul stay so positive? How did he find this peace, inner peace, even though things kept coming at him? We got to realize that Paul, yes, he saw some great victories, but Paul saw a lot of problems. He'd get over one thing, he started like, I'm sure he was like we are. We get over something. We get some good news and we say, whoa, I'm glad that's over and that's past. Now I'm going to have peace all the time. No, you're not. You're just living in the meantime. There's something else coming down the road. We've got to learn to have the peace of Christ in the midst of our problems and not waiting for it to stop happening. The key to being Christ-like, key to being like Paul, Jesus' great missionary, is to find out how to turn our anxieties into peace while we're in the midst of our problems. Now, last week I said there were three things that Paul did. One, he concentrated on God's grace more than in his own problems. In other words, he concentrated on the love of God that he saw rather than on his own aches and pains. If you focus totally on your aches and pains and don't get off of it, you're never going to get out of anxiety. You're never going to be any better. You're not going to find any peace. It's important. And so last week we talked a lot about that, but one thing we didn't do that I'm going to get done right now, and that is I asked one of our class members, I asked Cheryl Curtis, tell us, first of all, just give a summary of the story that I told in the book Prickly Pears about the fact that I got a thorn in my flesh. In fact, it was in my foot. And I told her, would you give a brief summary of what happened to me and then tell me how that, Cheryl, how that speaks to you in your daily life? Cheryl, would you speak to us?
Um, uh, when Bill wrote, it's called A Thorn in His Soul, SOLE, but also a thorn in his SOUL. And so Bill was a wee little guy at 7, I think, and still as handsome as he is now. He was living in South Florida, and he had a pair of black high top shoes that he would put on and go out and about in amongst the trees, the pine trees, and the palmetto bushes. But there were also cactus thorny bushes. And so he was carefree, running along in the fields, and stepped on a thorny bush, and it penetrated his sole of his shoe and went into his foot. And he hobbled home, And his mom was there to greet him and comforted him, but also shared in his pain. She let him know that she was going to have to take the thorn out, and yes, indeed, truthfully, it was going to be painful, but she was there right alongside with him. And he was crying, and he looked over, and she was crying as well. And he realized and asked her, "Why are you crying? I'm the one in pain." And he realized that she was sharing his pain. Realized that as his parent, she wanted to protect him and comfort him. And Bill likens that love and care to God's love and care for us as we experience pain. And that not only does he take the thorns out, sometimes we have other kinds of thorns that are causing pain and that we need to learn a great lesson. Sometimes it's just a physical, it's a health issue, but that he's always there alongside with us. He has not abandoned us. And to me, this story reminds me of a couple of things. When I was a little girl, I was about 7, and we lived in our neighborhood. We had a neighbor that passed away. And I realized at 7 that death, I did, cognitively, I didn't know what to do with that. And I became very afraid. My father picked me up and hugged me and just gave me a sense of security. And I still didn't understand death, but his comfort really helped me just feel safe. Then later on in life, my stepson was killed in a car accident. And I didn't really know as a parent what to do with that. It was very painful. And I realized that at first my initial reaction was, I've got to do something. It became like performance-based. The people around me are in pain. And I realized I didn't understand what the emotions were that were taking over. And I became very, very anxious. Started asking a lot of why questions. Why questions that could only be comforted by God. And once I stopped, and the message to me kept being, be still and know that I am God. I finally surrendered to that, and there was a peace. Couldn't answer all the questions. I realized it was okay to mourn. I realized it was okay to label my emotion, like you're saying, so it didn't own me. I've noticed a lot of times in my life when I'm anxious or there's a negative emotion, it'll come across like a big shroud over me. And once I name it and ask God to help me with it, then I know how to better wisely handle it. And so for me, I have to seek him continually to help me be still, to not handle difficulty being a performance-based person, just to be still and seek his guidance and his comfort. Also, recently, I walked alongside my brother and my mom as they passed away and the journey in hospice. And even though you want to protect and you want to comfort your loved ones, there is still, he's the great healer. And I found peace walking with him and being able to have the privilege to walk alongside my loved ones as they transcended this world. And I just, that peace and comfort calmed me.
Thank you, Cheryl. That is fabulous. I really appreciate your heart as well as your words. I think it's so true, just like in that story about me and my mom. One thing I can say about that I think all of you can relate to. When I saw my mother telling me, "Bill, this is going to hurt real bad when I take this thorn out of your foot," my mother always spoke the truth, no matter how hard it was. Um, but when she did it, it hurt like the dickens. But she was right there with me, holding me and comforting me. And it just quickly stopped hurting. Uh, Not just the physical pain, but the anxiety, because I could tell she wasn't just with me physically. She was with me emotionally. She hurt with me. She cared for me. I could tell Mama was going to take care of me. Folks, when you're going through cancer, or some of you out there going through other hard things, like Blanche talked about going through these terrible bouts of asthma, which are so frightening, no matter what you're going through, Jesus reminds us, not just in words, but he talked to his Father and he saw his Father's love. And there's something maybe, and maybe this is an overstatement, but maybe it's not. If when you're going through things that are hard, what's more important is not words and advice. What's more important is to see and feel someone's love. And when you look for what God is doing around you, when you look for the people He's brought into your life, when you look for the kind of nurses, doctors, hospital care that we have that so many around this world don't have, and you think how God must love me, how He's privileged me, how He's blessing me, my soul. An amazing thing happens to me, and I think that's what Paul has done here. He looked to God's love, to his grace, to the things he's bringing into my life. Something happens. My emotions calm down, my anxiety softens, and I don't hurt like I was. I had some pain that, you need to take all this medication for a while, but when you try and get off of the medication, you got to substitute it with something if the pain is still there. And you know what? When you go to work and you look for what God is doing, somehow the pain quietens and there's a softness to it. There's a gentleness to it. Peace and safety follow the awareness of God's love in your life in the different ways for each one of us. But I want to go to this second one. It's very important. I think Paul not only focused on God's love and what he's doing, he focused on the fact that he looked for God's greater purpose in his pain, in his problem, in his anxiety. He was searching for what God was going to do, what he was going to use all this for. When pain comes to us, we have a tendency to get zeroed in on the pain. And next we get zeroed in on why. Why is this happening? And then we get zeroed in on what am I going to do about it? I mean, we spend all this time focusing on the sore, focusing on the confusion of it. But what Paul did, rather than focus on his problem and his pain, he focused on God's future for him. He's thinking to himself, maybe God has something good to come out of all this. Maybe he's trying to teach me something. When your mind, which is a powerful thing, in my understanding, by the way, I'm going to throw this in that's a little extra, is there's a difference between your brain and your mind. Your brain is a physical hunk of muscle and nerves, but your mind is that which is spiritual. It's the eternal part of you that goes on when you die. It's that memory, it's those dreams, it's all of those feelings that you had and your loves. Your mind is that which is above the physical. So when your mind, you see, has something in something that's trying to drive you, that's that part of you that's going to say, yes, I hurt, but I want to focus more on just my physical pain. I want to focus more on what is God doing with this? What has he got in mind? Is it possible, Paul would say, that all of this has a purpose? That maybe God is going to take this and use it. Paul constantly looked for how God might be using his struggles for a greater good. By the way, put that phrase in your bank and bring it out as often as you need to? Is God doing something here for the greater good? You know what the greater good is? The greater good is the people around you. Or do you think that you are the center of the universe and everything that's done is about you? I hope not. I don't think anybody in this class that way, although maybe occasionally we get that way. No, the greater good is God may have something in mind for somebody else. Greater God may have something in mind for you that you might be a better servant. You see, Paul was always wondering, what in the world is this all about? God has plans. The way the scripture says, he put it this way in Romans. Paul said, we know that God causes everything, good and bad, to work together for the good, for those who love God, not just everybody, and are called according to what? His purposes. You could put that in another way. God causes things to work together for the greater good to those who are called, those who are paying attention to his purposes, his greater good, his plan, something he's got in mind for the future. Ricky this morning, in fact, last night, Ricky Burt got up not feeling well and he said he wasn't going to be able to be here. I had asked him to say, Ricky, have you had some things in your life that were painful, things in the life that were confusing, that caused us anxiety, but it turned out for the good. It's turned out for the greater good. He said, oh my gosh, I got so many. I said, well, could you pick out one and share it with the class? Well, that's what he was going to do. Well, since he wasn't able to do it this morning, I looked across the room and there was a little white-headed woman named Phyllis. And I said, Phyllis, how about you taking Ricky's spot and telling us, is there something in your life where you thought it was terrible, but it turned out for the greater good? She said yes.
He does this always with trepidation because y'all remember I'm a novelist and I get into too many details and it takes too long. And this story is about my writing. When you write your first book, writing a book is like giving birth. It's your baby. It's Blanche, you remember you were one of my early readers in my first book, and you protect it. Well, I had the opportunity to go out to the finest Christian writers conference in the country out in Mount Hermon, California. And I also had landed an appointment with the top agent in the top agency that represented Christian writers across the country. So I went out with great anticipation. I had my elevator speech and we had our appointed time and place to meet. And my hands were sweaty, my heart was racing, and I got there early and I sat and I sat and I sat. And he never showed.
Oh.
I was crushed because I had prayed. I had thought, oh, the Lord's finally, after all these years of my wanting to be a writer, the Lord is opening doors. And my spirit was crushed. And unfortunately, Bill was back in San Antonio, so I had nobody to hold my hand and say, it's going to be all right, Phyllis. But in the process, I met a lovely young lady who was with a top agency, not a Christian agency, just a top literary agency in New York City. And guess where she grew up? In Georgia. She understood Southern, which I am to the core. She understood my work, my goals for my work, because oddly enough, I never wanted my books to be confined to Christian bookstores because the people that I wrote the books for don't go to Christian bookstores. So, in my disappointment, I had no idea what God had planned. And Mary Beth became my agent, and she got my first book published with a publisher that was able to put it in places I never could have gotten that first book and gave me my start. So God had plans that were far beyond my disappointment.
Amen. Thank you, Phyllis. That was a perfect example and well told, as you can imagine, folks. But it's so true. Let me ask you, everybody here, is there anybody here, and you don't have to raise your hand or nothing, is there anybody here who doesn't face any problems of anxiety and stress and being uptight? No. Everybody has that. But let me tell you something. Paul discovered something that we all know. Jesus had it. He discovered that if you stop just looking at the problem and you look at the possible opportunities, the possible good things that God is going to use this for. You see, we have a tendency to think that our pain and our problems are meaningless hardships. Is something tough happening to you and all you can say about it, this is bad, I got to get rid of it and got to get out of it and move on? No, don't waste your pain. Don't waste your loss. Don't waste your suffering. Try and find, what can God do? What is he doing? What is he going to do with this? Is he going to turn it into the kind of agent you needed, not the one you thought you needed? So Paul did three things. One, he concentrated on God's love. He looked for God's greater purposes in his problems. And thirdly, was a very powerful thing. And I want us all to get it because it's something that you can do when you feel like you've lost complete control. Here's something you can get in control. Paul started talking to God as if he was right inside him. In other words, Paul decided he was going to make Jesus, he was going to make the Spirit of Jesus, he was going to make God himself more than just a God out in the blue. He was going to be within him. The way he put it was beautiful. Your body, you are controlled by the Spirit. He's talking to Christians, followers of Jesus. You, your body, your mind, all of you, is controlled by the Spirit if you have the Spirit of God living in you. So Paul's point was, if you're going to find peace and a feeling of safety, then you've got to focus on this. Your God lives in you. Your body, physical body, is a temple of something much bigger and greater. The God of the universe, through his unbelievable, unexplainable way, he himself somehow in spirit lives in you. Don't try and figure it out, just accept it. Imagine it. God himself. When I pray in the morning during Phyllis and I's morning prayer time, it seems like I keep coming back to it. Lord, we don't understand it, but here you are, right here, when you got billions of people. I don't get how you can be everywhere at once. I don't see how you can be right here in me, but your word tells me that I'm just a temple of your spirit. Think about this, folks. If you want peace in the midst of your anxiety, not afterwards, if you want safety, a feeling of I'm okay when things look like they're anything but okay, what would happen if God himself came and walked right beside you? How about something even better? What if he came and lived in you, in your mind, in your heart, in your body, and he was going to help you because he loved you? You were one of his children. Can you imagine? I'm going to ask you this. When I was a child, I always thought of God being like an old man up in the sky somewhere. You know, I grew up as an artist. I was painting portraits at 10 years old. And so I always was thrilled when I'd see pictures of Michelangelo's God. You remember he was an old guy with lots of muscles? Well, I always thought of God up in the sky as an old man with muscles. When you were a child, how did you picture God or Jesus? Anybody share that? I'm gonna have to pick on somebody if you don't tell me. Ron, when you were a little boy, how did you picture God in your mind?
Picture in the book.
Uh-huh. Good. Who else?
I think man with a long beard.
Yeah, you do. I like picturing.
You look a lot like Santa Claus.
Yeah.
That's right. Who else?
When I was little, I thought, I didn't think he walked. I thought he floated on a cloud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Who else?
I pictured him, Bill, as a large, white-headed man, and all I saw was the back of his head, and he had on a beautiful, bright green velvet stole or something. And he was in a lawn chair, looking out, sort of like looking out at the world. I never saw his face, but I sat behind him and talked to him.
Oh.
You know,
Read and
what?
feeling.
Thank you for that. That's so
Bill,
good.
Bill, I have the sound on now.
Okay.
You asked me. I guess I thought of God as just a very general sort of power up in heaven.
Yes. Yes. I think children, those of you who've taught children, children have this wonderful imagination. But when you think about children, if they're white, God's always white. If you're black, God's always black. Or as one of our friends, you all know, Norby Mayfield, she said, boy, I can't wait to go to heaven because everybody's going to be Spanish and everybody's going to speak Spanish, the language of heaven. Isn't it funny how our views of God are so often colored by our own background? But let me tell you a wonderful thing is that God, not just the New Testament, as the whole Bible points out, is so far beyond us, as far as the east is from the west. He has mind, his feelings, his actions. They are so great, so magnificent that we can't even begin to get them inside of imagination. We couldn't do that. So what happens is that we just have to say, somebody asked me, why do you call God he? And I said to this doctor, I called him he because Jesus did, and I don't have any better source to go to. You may think you're smart enough to figure out who God is and what he's like and where all that stuff. I don't feel like I'm smart enough to do it. And I'm sure not going to trust you or your cousin. I'm going to turn to Jesus because Jesus was here to show us the best picture of God the Father and God the Spirit. And Jesus said, call him Father, treat him like your father, picture him like your father. So when I start talking to him, sometime I picture a father. Sometimes I picture him, as somebody said, like a spirit, like the wind. But most of all, I think what Paul did, Paul thought of him both as father and as someone who lived in him as a spirit. God is spirit, and we must worship. We must praise. We must, as a spirit, like the wind who gives us life, who moves us. So let me tell you a little something. This last point is critical. Some of you who right now are under a great deal of stress for one reason or another, you know it and I know it, and it's a secret. Let me tell you what. Paul turned his feelings of being anxious into peace in the midst of his anxiety because he talked to God. He talked to Jesus as if some way beyond his ability to think, some way God's Spirit was within him. God's Spirit lived in him. He said, I pray that God, the source of hope, will fill you completely with joy and peace because you trust in him. And he said, then you will overflow with confident hope. He is our hope. He said, Christ in you is the hope of glory. He said, if you don't have the Spirit of God in you, living in you, you don't know him. And to know him, to rest in your anxiety, to overcome it, is to have that sense that he is in you and working through you. And guess what? When the when the body dies, when the brain dies and they can't think anymore, when the bones die, let me tell you what's left. The real you, the spirit you, the spirit who is in it, who is your mind, the spirit who is your eternal part. And when we can get connected to our spirit, to our conscience, our mind, those things that are of God, somehow those physical things become less. And God will use all those things around us to help us. But that's the key to finding Him. I'm going to ask you to do this. Whenever it says here, if you have the Spirit of God living in you, what does it mean to have? Have the Spirit of God living in you. It's talking about asking Him. He's not going to just come in and take over. Talk to Him. Ask Him. Ask Him to come into your mind, come in this morning, come in tonight. Talk to Him about it. Secondly, acknowledge where He is. Lord, I know you're in the whole universe, but for some miraculous way, Jesus said, you live in me. Paul said, you live in me. I acknowledge you're there. I can't understand it. I don't feel it, but I know you're there. Tell Him that. Ask Him, acknowledge, and last of all, abide in Him. Jesus told, if you abide in me and I in you, remember? So what are you going to do? You're going to say, I'm going to be at home with, that's what abide means. I'm going to be at home with the fact that Jesus is in me. I don't care what the rest of the world says. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to defend it. I just say it. I just admit it because that's what Jesus said. Let's trust in Jesus and then we will overcome our anxiety. Next week, we're going to talk about the second powerful emotion that we all have when we have some serious problem, and it is the emotion that I call the modern emotion of feeling victimized. When something happens, we feel like we've been unfairly treated. Why did this happen to me? Why this breakup? Why this loss? Why this pain? Why me? I don't get it. It's not fair. Why do other people, bad people, why do bad people have it all right and I don't? We feel like a victim. And we're going to talk about how to turn feeling like a victim into feeling like you're part of God's peace. Well,
Thank you, Bill, as always.